Hey, beer appreciators! สวัสดีครับ Welcome back to Beer Time Story, the platform where beer and brewing knowledge is shared. You know the drill, guys. Yes, we are back after a short while, and here we are entering the season two of the Good Burp session, which I'm very, very stoked about. What's waiting all of you down the road. It'll be a blast, I promise. All right. If we rewind the clock back about a year ago, the first episode of the Good Burp session was aired, which we sat down with Charlie Papazian and talked about home brewing through eyes of the pioneer. Now, to kick off the very first episode of this season, I would like to carry over that theme and further explore it, but from a different context, as the focus is shift from home brewing to the commercial side. That's right. Let's begin this season by having some good burps about craft beer professional brewing through eyes of the pioneer. Well, historically speaking, the rise of craft beers, was considered to start around the late 1980s in the U.S., and that was probably the first time after the prohibition that the beer scene in the U.S. became livelier and more colorful than just a shade of American adjunct lager from those large regional breweries that was kind of dominated the market at that time. Now, if I tell you that the spark that will light the fire of this craft beer revolution can be dated back to the mid 1960s, which was the period that numbers of breweries in the US was approaching the lowest point of all time in the modern history, of course. And the word craft beer or microbrewery didn't even exist yet. It was an unseen territory. Yes, that is the kind of pioneer that I'm talking about and anchor our story for this session around. As for the guest speaker for this episode, we are extremely blessed to have the man who lit that spark and paved the way for many generations of craft breweries to come join this session and shares his journey with us. He had gone by many titles, during his time, from the custodian to the brewmaster to the president, and the most apparent one that people recognize was the former owner of Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, California. So please welcome our guest speaker, Fritz Maytag. Hello, Fritz.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to the platform. It's such an honor to have you here.
No, pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. I'm curious to know why I see you have a Sapporo
Oh,
poster.
yeah.
You is
Yes.
that coincidence?
That's by design. Coincidentally, by design. I mean, yeah, I had a chance to visit breweries probably like years ago, and I came across this poster at their breweries in
I
Sapporo,
yeah.
and I completely fell in love with it. So by the time that I arranged this room, I think that I need to have that poster here. So I kind of search it, and here you go, it's there.
Okay, good.
Right, right. Yeah. So Fritz, so how's your day going? Pretty easy
It's
going.
going well. I'm actually in Phoenix, Arizona on a kind of a vacation. I have a house here in Scottsdale, and
Oh,
I used to live here as a boy, so it's like coming home to me. And I now come here 3 or 4 times a year for a week or two, and I just dearly love it. It's such a break from San Francisco. It's so
gotcha.
totally different. It's very relaxing to go from
Hmm.
from one world to another. It's all the United States, but boy,
Right.
Arizona and San Francisco are about as far apart as I don't know Thailand and Japan, maybe.
Yeah, completely agree. Completely agree. So you're traveling back and forth between San
I do.
Francisco area and here, right?
I do.
Okay, got you. It is hard to believe that it has already been 15 years, since you moved on from Anchor and began your new journey of your life. I'm curious, about what your days like nowadays. Are there any interesting projects or activities
Oh
that
yeah.
you've been
Oh yeah.
involved that keep you moving?
Well, yeah, that's actually probably a pretty good question.
Hmm.
Not long after I sold the brewery, I was doing what I've always done, which was running an experiment. I was growing algae in order to feed brine shrimp in the bathroom on the toilet, and I had a tank with light that came on at night, and a heater, and air bubbling, and on and
Mhm.
on. And my wife got upset and said, "This is not the place for these projects." My problem, I didn't have the brewery to play around
Play
with.
around, yeah.
So I shut down the project and put it in
That's
in the garage.
okay.
And not long after that, I woke up one morning and I had had a dream.
Hmm.
I dreamt that I was in my car and I had my experimental equipment with me in the car. I drove up to a little building. I hit the radio and the door opened and I drove in. I
Okay.
closed the door so that now I was in secret, and I
Right.
unloaded my stuff in the car, out of the car. Nobody to ask me anything, just to do my fun thing.
Right. Right.
I laughed. I thought, aren't dreams are wonderful? And then I thought, that is a very good idea. So I went looking for a building.
Okay.
First one I looked at was in the neighborhood of the brewery. And on the way there, I thought, no way. I've been driving down here for 55 years. I'm tired of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I went in the other direction and I bought a building out in the avenues in San Francisco near the ocean. A little square building, just perfectly simple, one room with a kitchen, which I've turned into a lab. And I have all my hobbies there, and I go there every day, almost like going to work. It's just fantastic. I've got microscopes, I've got distillery, I've got you name it, and I've got it. The 3D printer and the
Oh gosh.
ham radio. I don't know what all. So
Hmm.
it's a good question.
So you
I'm
got all
having a
kinds of
great,
of hobbies
I'm
around.
having a great time. I don't make
Cool.
beer. I never have made beer at home. I never would do that. No way.
Got you. But seems like you're having fun.
I'm
That's
having a
that's
great time.
really good. That's
Yeah.
really good. Yeah, I mean, like the reason that I asked this question because I cannot wrap my head around the idea of you being fully retired. Given all the fact that the things you have done with
It
Anchor.
took a long time for me to get there, but I did. That's a long story, but I did finally. And when I did retire, I was ready. I
Mhm.
had prepared myself for literally for years to let go. And
Right.
when I left the brewery, I truly I let go.
Gotcha. Gotcha. But for my sense, it's mean like retire from doing other stuff too, but you still keep things moving, right? I mean, do
Well,
the other
I
things, the
still have a
hobbies.
vineyard in up in the wine country.
Hmm. Hmm.
At one time, I had a winery. Only briefly, I had a little winery inside the brewery. Mostly, I have had a vineyard just as a farm. It's a country property where I
Yeah.
go to get away from the city and where I have all of the pleasures of farming and agriculture and another world. And I still have that. So
Hmm.
not entirely without a business project, but that's the only business I have.
Gotcha. Understood. All right. I think it is about the right time to begin the journey for this session and hear stories from you, like officially.
Fine.
So Fritz, let's turn the time back to your life before Anchor, during your youth, say around 1950s to 60s. The first question is that at that time, were you a beer guy?
Yeah, I was like most college students. Beer was my beverage of choice. There were two places that I used to go to hang out
Hmm.
in California. In those days, the law was you had to be 21, and I was 17. I had a good friend who introduced me to the owner of the favorite local bar and said, "Hi, this is Fritz, and he's 21, okay?" And the owner winked at him and said, "Great." And so I used to buy all the beer for my friends because I was 21. That
At
was
that
just
time, yeah,
beer.
yeah, yeah.
And it was called anyway. So, but I wasn't a big beer drinker. No. Later
Hmm.
in college, I drank wine with meals because San Francisco is very much of a food city and Italian, also especially Italian. There
Hmm.
were restaurants we went to where you could have dinner for $1 and they
Hmm.
would serve a glass of wine with the meal. and
Oh,
they didn't check your ID. So it was a world of wine in the city, but I was never a big wine enthusiast until later.
got you. And can you help
But I
describe
just drank,
the? Yeah,
I
please.
just drank lager beer. The main beer was Olympia. Just a
Hmm.
very, very light, very simple, light lager beer, and I didn't care. I drank Anchor Steam once or twice at the Oasis, which was the other famous local hangout.
Hmm.
And I thought it was a curiosity, but I didn't drink it regularly. I don't really remember having any thoughtful impression of it or
Hmm.
even asking much about why they had it. They took it out later. I think the beer was so bad in those days that it just was hard.
Hmm.
It was sour, and so it
Right.
was hard to drink. And when I got it back in, it was a big triumph for me. Anyway, so
Understood.
I was not
Understood.
a beer nut by any means.
Got you. And can you help describe, the landscape of the beer scene around that time? Like,
Oh
are
well.
there a lot of offerings or pretty much limited choice of beers around?
Well, as I say, in those days, I was not a beer enthusiast, and so I didn't really even care much. I would go on Friday nights to a fabulous Mexican place for tacos
Hmm.
where they made the tortillas right there by hand. It was
Yeah.
the real thing. And we always drank Dos Equis. And I remember
Hmm.
thinking, well, that's interesting. That's a beer with some character. It's kind of like a Mexican character or something. I don't remember. I just remember thinking this is interesting, but
Hmm.
I didn't bother especially to seek out anything special. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I was just a naive college kid.
No, that's completely fine. That's completely
And
fine.
the beers were all the same by and large. You could find an imported beer, but Guinness, for example, I'm not even
Hmm.
sure when I had the first Guinness. But basically, Americans in those days drank a light lager beer. I would say only later did the beers become really thin and almost characterless. They were beer. They were like in Japan. They were all light, pleasant lager beers. You got Kirin and Asahi and Sapporo and Suntory. And when I lived in Japan, Suntory made a dark beer. Come to think of it, but most
Hmm.
people drank light lager beers. It's thirst quenching. It's considered normal in warm climates, I think. In England, frankly, and I tend to go off on this subject, they drank light ales. They were fake.
Hmm.
They were fake ales. They were not all malt ales. You couldn't find an all malt ale in England until modern times. They were made with
Right.
sugar and barley malt, but they were stretched with sugar, and that way they could be the English equivalent of light. They were thin, if you will.
Mm.
They were
Right.
a little bit hoppy, a little bit bitter by boiling the hell out of the hops, I guess. I never was quite sure how they did that. They didn't
Right.
have any hop aroma, but they had bitterness and they were thin. And we used to joke about it when I was in England a lot selling our beers. All it takes to learn to love English ale is to be in a good pub on a Friday night, and on your second pint of the best bitter, you just love the stuff. And
I
I think
love it.
the same must have happened to many Englishmen who used to make fun of American beer. You mow the lawn, and there's nothing like a Coors Light. It's a
Hmm.
wonderful thing. Yeah. So anyway,
Right. Gotcha, gotcha. So yeah, apart from hanging out at the local bar and drinking beers at that time, did you ever practice any kind of home brewing or involved in any
no,
brewing activities at all?
nothing at all. Nothing.
Hmm.
Never dreamed of it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so we kind of have some good idea of the overview of beer scenes around that era. So the next, let's talk about you and Anchor Brewing Company. I understand that the brewery has been around since 1890 something. with
Yes.
Anchor name,
Yes.
and it would take you quite some time to get to know the brewery. So how do you get introduced to Anchor, Fritz?
Yeah. When I was after I left uh, college, I went to Stanford as an undergraduate, and then I studied Japanese at Stanford. I lived in Japan for a year studying Japanese language. And finally, I quit that and I moved to San Francisco. And I used to hang out at a place called the Old Spaghetti Factory.
Okay.
The Old Spaghetti Factory opened in 56, but I was there first in 57.
All
And
right.
that became what the English would call, it became my local. I
Mhm.
used to go there in the evening and met with a few friends, had a few beers. Maybe I might have dinner, but it was a very simple dinner. And it was a bohemian hangout in North Beach, which was the exciting place in San Francisco in those days. It was the so-called beat generation. And it was a bohemian neighborhood. And they had Anchor Steam on draft.
Right.
Long story. I mean, I could go on forever. The owner fell in love with Anchor Steam and with the idea when he first came to San Francisco. He told me that he got off the plane. His friend took him to this very famous local food market, which was almost like a European food market with stalls everywhere and a great
Right.
variety of food. He was from Chicago, and they had nothing like that in Chicago. His
Mm.
friend then took him to a bar that was in that food market, and they had a glass of Anchor Steam. And he said, "What's this?" And his friend told him it was a local beer. It was a funny, old-fashioned type of beer. And my friend said, I vowed that day that I would move to San Francisco, I would open a restaurant, and I would have Anchor Steam beer on draft only. And he did.
Wow.
The restaurant was there for decades, and he
Mhm.
never served any draft beer other than Anchor Steam. He kept the brewery alive for years and years and years, all by himself. When I bought the brewery, he
Mhm.
was selling about half of all of our beer.
Wow.
We only had about 10 customers.
He's one of the key customer for you,
So
right?
the Old Spaghetti Factory, that's what happened. And one day I went in and he asked me if I'd ever been to the brewery. I said
Mhm.
no, and he said, "You should go, Fritz. They're going to close. They're bankrupt and they're closing. And I think you would be really intrigued by it. It's the kind of thing that you would like." So the
Mhm.
next morning I went down to the brewery, and I think I already had a kind of a tickle in my funny bone, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I had a feeling that this might lead to something.
Mhm.
And I met the owner and talked. They were desperate for money. The primary investors were two advertising guys, and they were going bankrupt, and they did not want a bankruptcy on their record. So they were
Mhm.
willing to sell for nothing, really, and 51% ownership. So while we talked there, I agreed to buy the controlling interest, 51%. And I called my attorney down at Stanford, who used
Mhm.
to hang out at the Oasis, the same place that I went.
Mhm.
And I said, "Chan, you know Anchor Steam?" He said, "Sure." I said, "Well, get up here to San Francisco right now. We're going to buy the brewery." So he jumped in his car, he came up, and I bought control of the brewery. I had no idea it would lead to an avocation. I thought I was just helping out a local curiosity. You know, it was
Right.
a local curiosity, and San Francisco is very prone to enjoying its own history and appreciates. I'm going to see. I've got a funny light here. Uh,
Mhm.
I see. Let me move over here. I'll change this around somehow. Oh, I can't. I can't. Yeah, there. That's a little better, maybe.
Okay, that's a little better. Yeah.
So it was just a local curiosity, and I thought I could help it stay alive. Never
Mhm.
occurred to me I'd get deeply involved, but slowly I did.
Right. And that was in August 2nd,
65.
1965,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Okay. So before we move on, I'd like to show you one photo. Probably you can see it. Is that the old spaghetti, right?
That's
On the
it.
screen.
On the left,
Yeah.
that's the old spaghetti factory, and in the middle is a poster by a friend of mine, Wes Wilson, I believe, designed that one.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, but I think that's Wes Wilson. He became a close friend. I
Mhm.
used to sponsor those dances.
Oh, that's
Uh,
great.
guy
Yeah.
that was I used to loan him money and to run the dances, and then go down at 2 a.m. to get paid back. And then on the right, that's Joe Allen, who owned the brewery before the man that I became partners with.
Gotcha. And speaking of the old spaghetti, I've never thought that the atmosphere will be this kind of unique and funky way. Just reading the words and seeing the photo, you have the
Yeah,
chairs hanging around the ceiling
you
and
see
all that.
those chairs hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah, yeah.
That tells you everything you need to know. They must have had 100 chairs, and every single one was different.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's kind of a unique place to hang out.
Oh, it was great.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
it was great.
That's cool. Okay. Okay. Now moving forward. Moving forward. So August 2nd, 1965, you became the new owner of Anchor Brewing at that time. With very minimal brewing education, background and experience. Did you have any idea of what you just signed up for when you
No,
decided
I
to
had no
save the brewery?
I just thought they needed some money, and I
Hmm.
would see if I could maybe help with something. Give them a little help. I didn't know anything about beer or
Hmm.
business either, really. I just thought, they just obviously it's possible that they could survive, and let me see if I can help.
Okay. So at that time, I mean, like the idea of running a brewery is not in your mind at all, and not really sure how the survival of the brewery is gonna be, but they should be able to sustain. Can I put this way?
Well, actually, it's just I'm not sure it's I've ever told this story, but the day after I did the deal, I left.
Hmm.
Some friends and I had bought a VW microbus, and a bunch of us were going down to Mexico to study community development projects. I was interested in trying to help people in underdeveloped countries.
Hmm. Hmm.
This was in the 60s when that was a big deal. The Peace Corps
Right.
was started, and the idea was we can help these countries to become more successful financially and help the people.
Hmm.
It took a while, of course, but in the last 20 years, as I'm sure you are well aware, 2 billion people have come out of dire
Hmm.
poverty.
Right.
And the answer is the free market.
Mm.
But in those days, there were lots of theories about what to do and how to help these countries. And we were studying this because we thought we might try to do something like that. I'm going to
Hmm.
try to get out of the sun.
Sure, no problem.
Maybe if I sit back a little bit. It doesn't really bother me, but I think it's distracting. So we were interested in some kind of project like that, and we went to Mexico to visit. We had read all the books, we'd met all the people, we talked with all kinds of experts. We had one guy who was running the Quaker Community Development School in Massachusetts. He was one of our meeting us down in Mexico. So we were not naive, and I left the next day for Mexico.
Hmm.
And I can remember sitting in Mexico City or near Mexico City. We camped out every night, sitting on the ground near the campfire, thinking, I own a brewery. It was pretty exciting.
Right. Right.
Pretty weird. It'd be like, I mean, for you, I don't know what would be the equivalent. I own a sleeping bag factory. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
what in the world? So that was kind of exciting. I was gone for 3, 4 weeks, and when I finally got back, I went to the brewery and said, "Well, so what's happening?" And they said, "Well, we need more money."
yeah. Oh, okay.
Anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So, well, yeah. So that's how it all started. The beginning of your journey in the brewing world, commercially side. Now, from my research, I understand that it was not a smooth start for you either. In fact, your first couple of years with Anchor were pretty rough. So, Fritz, can you tell us about some of the trials and tribulations that you
Yeah, well,
faced
look,
running Anchor? Mhm.
I could go on forever. I actually, by coincidence, just the other day, I listened to a tape recording that I made back in
Okay.
1990. We had moved to our new brewery, and
Mhm.
a bunch of the guys who had worked for me at the old brewery went back to that building. It was empty, and so we were free to go in and look around.
Mhm.
And everybody told their stories and laughed, and then everybody left. And then I made a recording for myself, and listening to it the other day really brought it back. It was hell.
Okay.
It was a horrible building. It was dirty. It was broken down. The equipment was a disaster. We knew nothing about beer. The beer was sour. It went on and on. I can't tell you, but we started making pretty good beer by about 1970 or 71, I think.
Mhm.
There's a
So
book
6
about
years.
all there's a book
Mhm.
about all this. I don't know if you've seen the book, but
Yeah.
anyone who's
I
interested, you should get the book. I did not actually read the whole center part of the book is about my career. And it
Mhm.
was written by Dave Burkhart, who worked closely with me for 30 years and who was my right hand in
Mhm.
many, many ways and really did understand the inside of the brewery. And is a man of unusual education and skills. He's a master's degree in music from Yale. He plays the trumpet with the San Francisco Symphony and the San Francisco Opera, both
Mhm.
of which are as good as you can get. And he's their first choice always if they need an extra trumpet player. And he helped me in every imaginable way for 30 years at the brewery. And he wrote a, the story, and I found it almost embarrassingly accurate. I just couldn't even read it. I skimmed it because it's my story, and I just couldn't do it again.
Right.
It was
Right.
hell. And not only that, I was crazy. I was crazy for 10 years. I was insane. It was absurd what I was trying to do to turn this
Mhm.
ridiculous little dirty, filthy, weird, ignorant brewing thing into a commercial enterprise. I was just terrified of failure, and it
Mhm.
went from a curiosity to my all-consuming life. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. As a boy, I was interested in science. I had a laboratory. I called it my lab in the basement.
Mhm. Mhm.
I did all kinds of experiments, not the chemistry set, but just my own experiments. I had books on chemistry. And so when I got involved in the brewing business, to my amazement, I was made for it. I was
Yeah.
I was made for I loved it, and I was good at it, even though I was totally ignorant. I loved the learning of it and the doing of it. I was crazy and foolish in the sense that instead of doing the obvious thing, which would have been to go out and find a brewmaster and say, "Look, here's a whole bunch of money. Make this thing work, okay?"
Right.
I didn't know any better. I did it myself, and it took forever. But another story that maybe will tell the whole story. Not too long after I sold the brewery, I was at the new brewery in San Francisco,
Mhm.
that we built. We moved in '79. I was in the brewery and I walked from the top floor down all the way down to the basement, 4 floors. And later I realized that I had designed and installed and made the decisions on every cubic inch of that brewery. Mind you, I had
Mhm.
incredible help in terms of people helping me think it through, helping me install it, helping me design it, helping me think, plan it.
Right.
But it was all my doing. And I then realized that in the mid 70s, I probably knew more about brewing broadly
Mhm.
than anyone in the world because there were countless people who knew more about any given field than I did, bacteriology, for example.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I knew brewing bacteriology. I knew how to do the gram stain. I was doing
Yeah.
anaerobic culturing of lactobacillus organisms with the anyway. I knew all I needed to know about everything in the brewery.
Yeah.
I
Very
had
versatile.
I had scraped the pizza off the empty beer kegs in the back of the stupid bar that was always didn't pay their bills. I
Mhm.
had
Mhm.
delivered the beer. I could take the wooden bung out of an aluminum beer keg with a special tool. I'm probably the only man in the world alive who has ever seen that tool. There's a special kind of hammer chisel that we
Mhm.
use to take wooden bungs out of barrels. And anyway, so it was a curious thing that I was made for it, and I loved it, and it grew and grew on me. But I was crazy, and I was terrified for 10 years. So
Got you.
it's not necessarily for me. It's a great story. But I think for other people, it's kind of like an idiot who got sucked into something he never should have done. But for me, it was wonderful. Absolutely the best thing. I was so fortunate.
Got you. And I went through that book that you mentioned, and
Oh
I
yeah.
found that you spent like the first couple of years, like 2 years, cleaning up the breweries, running
Oh,
around with the
oh,
microscope.
tell me
That
about it.
is, yeah, that's I was crazy, yes, but with pure dedication that you want to resolve issues,
It's
right?
worth pointing out that in those days there were two ways of brewing. There was the English way,
Hmm.
which was the old way, and that is where you have a brewery and you
Hmm.
and the brewery owns its own pubs,
Right.
or it has a chain of pubs with whom it has a close relationship.
Hmm.
The beer is full of bacteria, and it goes out to the pub, and it starts to spoil. But beer doesn't spoil for several weeks. And so they're serving the beer, and the first keg is gone, the first cask, and that's fine. And now they're tapping in the second cask, and maybe about 2/3 of the way down the second cask, one of the guys in the pub says, "I say, Charles, don't you think the beer's a bit sour?" And he tastes it and he says, "Oh, I think it is a little bit sour." So he calls the brewery, and they come and take those kegs away tomorrow, and they bring new ones.
Oh,
And
okay.
that was the way beer was always made.
Hmm.
Nobody, I mean, Pasteur, this was,
Yeah.
what was his dates? 1880s?
1807. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Around that time.
pasteurizing beer. But the rest of the world, Germany, for example, Europe,
Hmm.
America, Mexico, Japan, you can't just take beer in a wooden cask down the street and leave it there until it gets sour. People want beer in bottles, and they want beer 100 miles away, and they want beer in hot weather. And so
Right.
all over the world, beers did not spoil. They were clean, 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 and almost always pasteurized. Now, we did not pasteurize our beer. We kept it cool. Uh,
Hmm.
and then eventually, when we started bottling, we did pasteurize. But um, so our brewery was simply an old brewery. It was it was the last medieval brewery in America.
Hmm.
It was dirty. It was hopeless.
Right.
I was in breweries in England where the only laboratory equipment was a hydrometer that had spider webs.
Oh,
It had dust and spider webs. Saccharometer.
oh, never been touched
You
before.
don't need a lab. If your beer only lasts for 10 days, you just go get it.
Hmm.
Anyway, so I learned. I
Yeah.
learned the hard way. Tell me, believe me. Oh man.
All right. So let's look at the old grumpy brewery of yours. This is the some of it, right? The
Yeah,
mash
for
tun, the
sure.
boil kettle, and you also use the open top fermenter too
Oh yeah, we
at
still do.
Anchor.
Yeah,
Hmm.
of course. That was part of the traditional
Signature.
theme. I wanted to be as traditional as possible, so we wouldn't want to get rid of that. And
Hmm.
I think it's worth pointing out that San Francisco's climate is extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's even better than England. And,
Hmm.
I can tell you right now what the temperature is in San Francisco. It's 55 or
Okay.
56 or
Hmm.
57. And I'm thousands of miles away, but I know what the temperature is. Now, yeah, I might
Yeah.
be off. It might be one of those very unusual days when it's 60
Hmm.
or even 65, at noon, but it's cool. And every night, it's 57, 56. It's great for brewing. And so an open fermenter with cool air, the heat of
Hmm.
fermentation, the shallow fermenter, they're not just open, they're shallow. So
Right.
you have a large surface to volume ratio. This
Hmm.
is crucial. And that's why it gets rid of the heat of fermentation. And so that keeps the bacteria down.
Right. That's the way that you control the fermentation, right? By
Absolutely.
relying on the Mother Nature, San Francisco
Shallow
climate.
open fermenter. Yeah.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
cool weather. People used to ask me what temperature did they brew beer at in the old days?
Hmm.
And the answer is in the old days they brewed beer at the temperature. They didn't have cooling.
Hmm.
Germany figured out ice. The lager was
In the
became
ice cave.
using ice, but basically
Yeah.
beer was brewed at the temperature. And
Yeah.
so in ancient Sumeria, they probably fermented it in the 80s. I don't know.
Yeah. At that temperature.
Above 98, the yeast gives up. So you can.
Right.
That's all you know. It was fermented at the temperature, but there's nothing like cool air and a shallow open fermenter. That's the trick.
That's the best case.
Yeah, or a small fermenter, very small, large surface to volume ratio.
Yeah. Gotcha. And that is utilized at Anchor, and it also contributes to the unique characteristic of the beer too.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. In the lower picture on the right, that's my partner, Lawrence Steese. He owned 49%, and it was he who had the vision of keeping the brewery alive when Joe
Hmm.
Allen retired. And Lawrence Steese and I disagreed about how to brew beer, but we didn't
Hmm.
disagree about life. He was a wonderful, charming, loving, eccentric, genuine man. I mean, he was an extraordinary character, a real character. He was a San
Hmm.
Francisco character, and we disagreed about brewing, and we parted company. He didn't want to be German. He wanted to be British. If you're with me on my
Hmm.
example earlier, he liked having things just be kind of chaotic and
Hmm.
kind of casual, and scrubbing and sterilizing just struck him as kind of unnecessarily uh, difficult, and
Hmm. Hmm.
just
Hmm.
relax and sell the beer and have a good time, and he did
Right.
have a good time, and I just loved the man, and when I parted company with him, he did me a great favor, and I never failed to compliment. I see his daughter occasionally, and I always thank her, tell her how grateful I am. He sold me all of his shares. I
Right.
paid him a premium for them, mind you. It was like a retirement plan or something,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it
Hmm.
was based on reality, which was nothing much in those days. This was 1969, and we were pretty much nothing. And I paid him a nice price, but he sold me all of his shares
Hmm.
because he knew that it was not a good idea to hang around and be an investor. I would have had to go to him and ask his approval, over and over, or run roughshod over him and not feel good about it.
Not feel good about, yeah.
He sold me his shares, and I now was the owner. He went down to
Right.
Costa Rica to run a large ranch in Costa Rica, which was just perfect for him. He was a jack of all trades. He would have just loved that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
And
it's nice to see him there.
good. And he was the head brewer at that time, right? Before you bought.
Yeah, we called him the brewmaster, but he was basically, we only had one employee. It was
So he's everything.
Lawrence and Dave, and that was it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then me.
Right. And here you are, putting on the lab coat and running around the brewery, trying to
Well,
learn how to brew.
that was later. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next thing that I'm curious about, Fritz, is that, when, because like you came from the background with, has no experience in the brewing before and learned from the real job, right? And, when the technical brewing problems arose, where did you find resource to help you resolve it, or
I
guide
read
you?
De Klerk.
Okay.
I had a library of brewing books, and I had one man, a retired salesman for Wallerstein, which was the brewing adjunct company. They were the primary company that sold supplies to brewers, and he traveled around the West with a microscope in the trunk of his car. And he called me after I bought the brewery and asked me if I wanted any advice, and I said sure. So he told me a little bit about how we should clean up, and he had a couple of other suggestions. But I began to read books, and I found De Klerk, who is the Belgian brewer scholar, and his books, 2-volume books, were translated by an English woman into English, and that was my Bible. I wore out volume 1. Volume 1 is how to brew, and volume 2 is how to measure what you've done. And I wore out volume 1. I had to buy a second copy of it. My copy was literally falling apart at one time. So, and I taught myself. I was self-taught. We got help from other brewers, but it's hard to explain. We were unique. There was nothing like it in the world. Before we moved out of our old brewery, this stupid, dumb building, God, leaked. Rain came in. But in that little building, we had the most modern small brewery in the world.
Right.
I can explain to you why if you're really into brewing.
Please, yes, I am.
I would even argue that we had, in some ways, we had the most modern brewery of any size in the world. We were all stainless steel.
Okay.
We were all cleaned in place. CIP.
Okay, CIP, yeah.
Every valve was a sanitary valve.
Okay.
The kind that can be cleaned and sterilized.
Right.
We were all malt and only hops and water, period. So very, very traditional. Carbonated entirely by fermentation under pressure. No carbon dioxide injected.
Right.
Water, yeast, barley, hops, period. We were centrifuging the beer. We were flash pasteurizing the beer. There was only one other brewery in the world doing that. We were filling with carbon dioxide for counter pressure. We had some of the lowest oxygens of any beer in the world, I'm sure. I don't know if that's not enough. I could go on, but Coors was as skilled, and they were sterile filtering, not flash pasteurizing.
Yeah.
But their tanks were not stainless; they were steel. They were ceramic.
Okay.
Coors was a jewel.
Right.
And I would never dream of saying we were better at brewing than Coors was, but I tell you, our funky little goofball setup was as good as Coors in any way you can think of.
That's amazing. And it's pretty caught me off guard, when I heard you mention the centrifuge and the flash pasteurizing, and
Yes.
that's a flash pasteurizing the steam stream of beer, right? Not in the package.
Yes, that's the whole idea. You see, when you put beer in the bottle,
Hmm.
there's always some oxygen in the bottle. I don't care how good you are with
Hmm.
carbon dioxide counter pressure and foaming over the top to get rid of the air. There's
Right.
going to be a little bit of air, and that means oxygen. And so when
Hmm.
if you heat that up, which you hope you never do, but if you do, you're going to get oxidation, and that's
Hmm.
going to help you get a stale flavor. And it
Hmm.
won't happen right away, and it won't. There are other ways of making sure it's less, but heating that beer up to 145 degrees Fahrenheit
Hmm.
is going to cook the beer. And then, if you're really good, you cool the beer down with cold water before you put it in the case. But
Right.
that is expensive.
Hmm.
And so most breweries who used to pasteurize would simply take the warm bottle and put it in the case. So now the beer's going to be hot and then warm for hours and hours and hours.
Hmm.
And I was just determined that I would not do that. And so we sterile filtered at first, but I
Right.
found that that was so tricky. And I thought filtering that tight just couldn't be good for the flavor, the character. You're going to
Mm.
somehow, I've kind of changed my mind on that. I've come, because of my winemaking experiences,
Right.
I've come to believe that you can sterile filter a fine, rich wine or beer and probably not lose anything. But boy, in the 60s, I didn't believe that. And
All right.
so we started flash pasteurizing. I met a brewmaster who was extremely helpful to me. He was the only brewery in the world doing it.
Hmm.
I also read an article in a journal, technical journal, that Coors had written. They were
Oh.
experimenting with flash pasteurizing some of the leftover beer in their empty tanks to try to
Hmm.
recover it, but
Mm.
not have it be a problem for spoilage, to blend it back in with the regular.
Mm.
They had experimented with flash pasteurizing, and they actually, if you read the article carefully, you found what I came to believe, which is it actually might improve the flavor of the beer.
Mm.
What
Oh.
what you do here is the effect of the heat is logarithmic. So one pasteurization unit is 140 Fahrenheit for one
One
1 minute.
second. Oh,
That's
one.
what
Okay.
1 pu.
Right.
It takes about 10, 11, 12 PUs to be sure that your beer is sterile. It'll depend
Hmm.
a little bit on the beer, a little bit on the bacteria content, but you know, 10 minutes at 140, or if you go to 143, then the time goes down.
Right.
And
Right.
what we used to do was to flash pasteurize in a heat exchanger, which is where hot water comes in and heats
Hmm.
up the beer,
Right.
and then cold water comes in and cools the beer down.
Right.
And we would heat the beer to 163 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there for about 11 seconds.
Okay.
And that is equivalent to 10 or 15 minutes at 140.
40. Yeah. Yeah.
And the effect is negligible. It's just nothing. It's a growing trend. I don't know whether your brewers in Thailand are aware of it, but I see in this country a lot of smaller brewers are doing flash pasteurizing, and there's a
Hmm.
company that will sell you a little miniature kit that just makes
Hmm.
it easy. You just plug it in, and there you go. We had quite a time learning how to do it, but there was another brewer doing it. It was actually in Texas, and
Hmm.
he opened up and showed me and took me under his wing, and I just bang, we were doing it, and I was thrilled.
Hmm.
I'm
And
a
that was
believer in
1970s, right?
I'm a big believer in flash pasteurization. Yeah, that
Hmm.
was in 70, early 70s.
70, 71. Yeah. It's pretty interesting. And, it's kind of reflect me the way you embrace brewing science, technology, and the passion you have for the brewing process too, harnessing the power of, all those technologies and equipment to your funky brewery.
Well, yeah, I mean, we poured in the effort.
Right. Right. True. Okay. I think now it is time to talk about the making of Anchor's beer from the ingredients perspective first. I wonder if there were a lot of options and selection offered back then, Fritz. So let's talk about how and where, briefly you source all of the ingredients. We can start with malt first, and then yeast, then hops.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
when I bought the brewery, they were using caramel coloring to get the deep color. That was very common in America, still probably common all over the world. Many brewers make a dark beer by just adding caramel coloring.
Hmm.
There's nothing wrong with caramel. It's a wonderful natural
Flavoring.
product.
Right.
Sugar, you heat up sugar and it turns brown, and it gives you a nice flavor and a feeling of good taste. They
Hmm.
were adding coloring to the beer. I decided we can't do that, so I went to specialty maltster. In those days, it was a rare thing to use dark malts,
Hmm.
but they were used in bakeries, baking
Right.
cookies
Right.
and breads and stuff. And so I began to buy what I would call caramel malt, lightly roasted malt, and we did
Right.
careful blending experiments until we got the color and the flavor where we wanted it. And in my own opinion was that it was more color than flavor. I think there's no doubt that there's a flavor to caramel
Uh-huh.
malt, and it's a nice additional touch. Makes a difference between just a bland beer and a little bit of something nice that you get your
Mm.
figure, you get your taste around. But
Right.
the
Right. Right.
color is key. It triggers in the drinker's mind. It triggers the idea that this is a little bit more flavorful. This is
Mm.
maybe a little bit more old fashioned or a little bit richer. And of course, it was, and it is. And I wanted that. And so
Mm.
we did a blend of two row malted barley, which we bought locally.
Right.
It was a local maltster. Was kind enough to sell it to us in just in little, a few 100 pounds.
Hmm.
And then I bought the caramel malt in sacks from Wisconsin. And
Hmm.
then we used hops. We experimented with different hops. I ended up using Northern Brewer hops.
Hmm.
Long story. I mean, I wandered around with hops, and I have my opinions about hops. And hops has exploded. In those days, there were only a few varieties that were normal.
Right.
Today, of course, with the craft brewing movement, the explosion of hop varieties is
Right. Is yeah.
extraordinary, and it's made a big difference. Beers are much more interesting. And then we used yeast. We used to get our yeast from other lager brewers because we can't. You can't. I only brewed once a month, and you can't
Hmm.
yeast around it. It turns sour. I mean,
Right.
full of bacteria eventually, and so I mean, it's just that you're starting out with sour beer instead of. And so we used to get our yeast from the lager breweries. There were 5 breweries in the Bay Area, and I used to go to one and then go to another and then another. So I only bothered them once or twice a year.
For the year.
They
Yeah.
were very friendly, very helpful. They would laugh up their sleeve at us.
You
But
miss us.
one thing I need to mention, in case anyone doesn't know, the
Hmm.
brewing business is a club.
Right.
It's a trade in the best sense of that word, in the old sense of that word. It is a trade. If you are a brewer and you walk into another brewery, they roll out the carpet for you because you're a
Hmm.
brewer. It's
Hmm.
brotherhood. It's hard to explain. And I got that right away. The other breweries took me under their wing, even though they laughed at us, I'm sure, but behind our back. But they were in the trade, they treated us like brewers. And it was a remarkable thing that I can even now, I mean, I get tears in my eyes thinking about it. It's a,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is, which is a lovely,
Wonderful. Yeah. It's
lovely.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Right. So it seems like sourcing the ingredients with the sense of variability or selection is not kind of a big problem. You just have to know where to ask for or look for such ingredients, right? But the hops back then are only available in whole cone, right? There's no pallet things, no extract at all.
Well, I think there were. I don't know what other people were doing for sure.
Hmm.
I just right away realized I want to be as pure and simple and traditional as
Mm,
possible because it's good for marketing. We've got to have a story. You know,
right.
what the world wants is a good story that's true.
Hmm. Hmm.
There are a lot of good stories that aren't true, and there are a lot of true stories that aren't
I'm
true.
good.
But if you've got a good story that's true, you're way ahead of the game, and that's what I wanted.
Hmm. So the whole cone is the option for for Anchor always.
Yes, yeah, tradition,
Right.
simple, natural, old-fashioned tradition, purity,
Hmm.
purity.
Purity. Yeah, and you also established a close relationship with the hop farmer in the early days too, right?
We did. We had a. I became dear friends with a man, John
John Siegel.
Siegel, yeah,
Hmm.
who's had a hop ranch in
Yakima up there,
Yakima, yeah,
or
in Yakima, and was very involved in experimental hops for Budweiser. They sold a lot of hops to Anheuser-Busch
Budweiser.
and other
Hmm.
brewers, but they were especially strong with Anheuser-Busch. And Anheuser-Busch, of course, was always into research, and he gave me really great advice and really great advice in many ways on hops. We became very close friends. He was a lovely gentleman.
Hmm. Hmm. That's wonderful.
It's a
And this is
curiosity.
just, yeah,
The
please.
company was called the George Siegel Hop Company. That was their father.
Right.
And
Oh, okay.
my friend's brother was George Siegel, the famous actor. That was
Oh,
kind of a secret, but it was true. And it was I only met him once, but and I didn't really. I was never a movie. I was too busy
movie guy.
with movies. I I
Of
missed out on
course.
all the popular culture. My
Oh,
wife
yeah.
still makes fun of me. I don't know what happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I was too busy trying to make.
Until 2010, right? It's like,
But
okay, I see the
I
world
met
now.
George Siegel, the actor, once. A very nice man. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Okay. The last one for the ingredients that's just sticking in my brain here. Do you recall like how long it take you guys to develop your own house yeast?
Well, that's a good question. We kept the same yeast for decades,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think I dimly remember talking to my staff about this once, and we were not sure that we could agree on where it came from.
Okay.
We fiddled around with some cultured yeast. Um, anyway, we found a yeast we liked. I would say another thing, one of the developments that occurred in the brewing business during my time was we learned how to wash the yeast. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. Acid wash, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think this was unknown. I don't remember de Klerk talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, you put it into a super low pH.
pH. Yeah.
We used to use phosphoric acid, and you can use any acid, but
Mm-hmm.
people like phosphoric because it's organic and it made you feel good.
Yeah.
But that is the answer to keeping, in my experience, that's the answer
Mm-hmm.
to keeping a good, healthy, clean yeast. You know,
Right.
you need to take care of the nutrients on the yeast also, of course, but
Right.
basically that allows you to keep using the yeast. And we were surprised. We had an ale yeast also. We had two yeasts in the new brewery that
Mm-hmm.
we kept for years and years and years. We kept them separate, but we never had a conflict with them.
Mm-hmm.
It was a
Mm-hmm.
top fermenting yeast, and I would say this. I often say I refuse to ever give up the title of brewmaster because I had a friend,
Mm-hmm.
an acquaintance who owned a brewery back east, a lager brewery, one of the old family breweries that just made boring, plain lager, and
Mhm,
they had
mhm.
to make it as cheap as they possibly could in order to compete with the Budweiser, because the
Right.
hope was to be a little bit cheaper and maybe somebody would buy their beer. And also locally, they tried to be local beer.
Mhm,
And I asked him, I used to talk to these people, why don't you do something interesting?
mhm.
Brew something interesting and charge a premium and make a profit. You're going bankrupt. And he said, Fritz, I asked my brewmaster, Otto, and he said, we can't have two yeasts in the brewery.
Oh, right.
Well, my brewmaster was Fritz.
Yeah.
no,
Talk to me
no,
then.
no Otto at our house. And I refused
Right.
to give that title up because I saw what happened when the owner doesn't know what's going on.
Mhm,
Mind you, one of my key employees, Mark Carpenter, if you
mhm.
walked into the brewery, you would have said, "Oh, well, Mark's the brewmaster," and in many ways, he was. He ran the brewing, and
Right.
but he would never have dreamed of making a change without talking to me. Likewise, I wouldn't have suggested something without talking to Mark and Gordon. I had two key guys in production.
Right. Right.
But I kept that title. I called myself owner and brewmaster
That's
because of the
excellent.
very question, the yeast question. Uh,
Mhm.
we kept two yeasts and we did what we wanted. And
Yeah,
if it
you did
didn't
just
work,
fine.
we changed. But we weren't scared of anybody, you know.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was.
All right. Okay. So we are at the tail end, approaching the tail end of the session. I have like a few questions left. So I
Sure.
think it is also a good time to talk about Anchor's beer. We know about the ingredients already. You know, at that time when the market was kind of flooded with American adjunct lager, and the consumer kind of get accustomed to that taste somehow,
Yep.
instead of going down the same road with others. That's just not the case for Anchor. For the first 10 years, you persistently offer a different style of beer, and for the first 10 years Anchor has only one beer
Yes.
that's on sale, which surprised me as well, and that's Anchor Steam
Yes.
beer, which you have
We
reiterated
had
its
to brew it
entity.
dark.
Right.
We began brewing dark. We had Anchor Porter. Forget
Oh,
when that was. I don't remember.
the porter probably around the
71.
early of yeah,
Sure.
early of 70. But right, like you've done a lot of trials and try to just master the entity of the steam beer,
One beer. Yes.
right? And later on you start adding more
Yes.
beers to Anchor's
Yes.
portfolio, and I dare say that most of them were kind of lost or unheard of from the US land at that
Well,
time.
that's for sure. They were considered bizarre.
Right. So can you help talk about the
There was no, when we launched Anchor Porter, there was no porter in England.
right?
Not even in England.
That was wild. That was wild. So can you just help briefly talk about the creation of some of the hallmark beers you initiated? What is the backstory behind them? We can start with steam
Well,
beer
the
first.
Anchor Porter was
Oh.
the first, and the reason was the previous owner, when I first got involved, they made a dark. They called it dark beer, and they just added
Right.
caramel coloring.
From the
Well, I
steam
got
beer,
rid of
right?
that right away. I didn't want to have a fake beer,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so I got rid of that, and disappointed a lot of customers because a lot of bars, some of our customers had light steam and dark steam. It was just the same beer with color.
Mm-hmm. With different color.
But so I wanted to make a real dark beer, so I made Anchor Porter.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the next thing we did was we did an ale in 1975. In fact, yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the day we brewed that beer, the 18th of April, 75. There's a famous poem about the American Revolution that starts like that. And
Uh-huh.
that was Paul Revere's Ride. And I knew that the bicentennial was coming, 200 years since the American Revolution, and in '76, and so I thought it would be fun to get the jump on the rest of the world, and so I brewed Liberty Ale on April 18th in '75.
Hmm.
And I didn't like the product at all. Long story. I went to England then to study ale brewing. Didn't much like what I saw there in terms of tradition,
Right.
uh, but I did like one product. I didn't think they were doing it very well, but I liked the idea, which was barley wine, which is
Okay.
an ale that ferments, stops because the alcohol gets to a certain level and the yeast stops fermenting, and so it's sweet. And
Hmm.
I thought that was a great idea. So we came home and brewed a barley wine in the fall of '75. And then we did another ale, which was Christmas, the first Christmas ale.
Hmm.
We decided that we didn't like the ale we'd made in April. So we brewed an ale in November, and we labeled it. We made, I forget, 100 cases or something. We
Hmm.
labeled it with just a single label that said Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I gave it to my friends. We sold a little bit, but it was a great idea and an idea that I knew about. There had been ales in England and in other countries based on holidays or special religious fests.
Hmm.
But we began to do that every year, and it was a brilliant idea. I got to admit it. It really was. I used to say there's two things that brewer needs. One is a beer that you sell only in the winter when sales go down.
Hmm.
The other one is a sign so good that the retailers will pay for it. Well, I never got that, but we did the Christmas beer, and that was and everybody does one now. All over the world,
Yeah.
do a winter
Yeah.
beer or whatever. But believe me, there was nothing like it at the time. There had been others, no doubt about that,
Hmm.
but it was unique at the time, and it was a very, like all of our beers, very slow to take off. But
Right.
gradually, we built a market, and it became a big deal at the brewery.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
and then what else? Well, anyway, that's enough.
Yeah. So I would like to get back to porter just a little quick.
Dude,
So yeah, so the porter that you brew, you mentioned that for the dark caramel malt you got from the
well, we
bakery.
got
So
black patent malt for the porter.
okay.
I can still remember the day I brewed the first porter. I was standing up on the mash tun,
Hmm.
opened the opened the bag, paper bag,
Hmm. Hmm.
started slowly feeding the black patent malt down into the mill.
The
We had
mill. Hmm.
a little two-roller mill,
Hmm.
and the smell came up, and I thought, "Oh my God, they sent coffee." It smelled like coffee. I thought, "Oh,
You
geez,
still roast the ash,
I got the
right?
wrong stuff." And that porter never changed. The formula never changed. I dreamed it up,
Hmm.
with my pencil. I just worked out the formula, and
Hmm.
that is just a great product. As it always was a great product. I just love that product. Yeah.
That's cool. So in terms of recipe design, like do you have any reference or you just kind of
Oh, I had all kinds
balls
of
and
books. I had
okay.
no end of brewing books. I
Hmm.
read about brewing. I mean, I knew a lot about the history of brewing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And you use those kind of resource, connect the dots and come up with the recipe and
Oh
you
yeah.
brew it,
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Just
right?
use it, common sense and imagination. And by then,
Hmm.
I knew a lot about beer and brewing and stuff. So we
Got
used
you.
to joke
And
about the fact that we never threw anything away. If we did an
mhm,
experiment, we would sell it.
experiment, but you don't
Just like
have
that,
like a
the products would change.
course, but you don't have like a pilot brewery, right? You always have that.
Never, never.
Never.
I was
Hmm.
determined never to have a pilot brewery. I knew a brewery that had. There was a local brewery
Hmm.
in San Francisco, and they put it in a pilot brew house, and then they went bankrupt. And I thought, yeah, well, that you just should. You don't want to play around. You're a brewer. You're a brewer, and so we used to brew experimentally. one of the things we used to joke about it a little bit, the Christmas ale would change sometimes a little bit because we used a different formula every year.
Okay.
And we used different herbs and flavors, spices,
Spice. Okay.
unusual ingredients. We had a secret name for a company. We used to order this stuff and ship it to a different location so that
Right.
nobody would know. It was always a secret, top secret.
Mhm.
And anyway, we used to change that a little bit sometimes. And
Play around with it.
the first shipments always went to Sweden. We started selling Christmas ale in Sweden quite early. It had been an old Scandinavian tradition to have a Christmas ale.
Okay.
And they would buy a goodly amount, but they government stores, a single customer, and they wanted it early. We had to ship it. We had the barley harvest was late August,
Right.
and we used to our maltster used to make malt for us. We bought malt from a single farm for the Christmas ale, just for fun, just to put some character in the product.
Right.
We never talked about it, but we knew that all the Christmas ale came from one family farm, which was
okay.
a nice thing. But we had to rush that barley down to Los Angeles to be malted in order to start brewing, in order to get those containers on the ship to get to Sweden.
Time.
So we used to joke about how the Swedish Christmas ale sometimes was a little different because we were learning on the Swedish Christmas.
Right. They are the first. Right.
We would never have sent out anything that we didn't think was wonderful, but we would just tweak it a little bit.
Right. Right. You learn from that batch.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, porters kind of lost from US land and it's kind of revived from Anchor, and that's pretty cool story. For the Christmas ale, it then become the Liberty Ale, right? In around 1980s.
No, actually what happened was that I got married in 87.
Okay.
And we brewed a bride ale, a special beer just for our wedding, which was an old English tradition. And for the first time, we put some spices in the ale. I knew that had been an old tradition. So I thought we would revive that for our bride ale, so it would be different. And it was so good that that was the formula for the 87 Christmas ale a year later. We got married in January. A year later. But Liberty Ale evolved. I'm actually a little uncertain. If you want to really know about it, you read the book. Dave Burkhardt got the story in there. But Liberty Ale became, at the time we released it, it was so hoppy that it was just considered bizarre. Nowadays everybody says, "Oh, an IPA." I knew about IPA, India Pale Ale. I knew about that tradition, but I did not call Liberty Ale IPA. I just called it Liberty Ale. But it was really the only IPA in the world at that moment when we released it.
Right.
It was distinctive. It was shocking to many people. That was the whole idea. Our brewery was so small, we couldn't make a lot of anything. We wanted to have a product that would make people jump, with joy, the ones who loved it, and pay a premium for it. That's the whole thing. You can't be small and not charge a premium. So you've got to be better or more interesting or both.
Got you. And there are two things that I think worth mentioning here is that the Liberty Ale is probably one of the, I would say, official beer that's used Cascade hops for the very first time.
We were the first. Yeah, we used it in a Christmas ale first, and then we put it in the Liberty Ale. That was John Siegel's idea. He came to me and he told me, "Fritz, there's an experimental hop called Cascade, and I think it has an ale quality. You should try it.
Okay.
We tried it in the Christmas ale, and we loved it,
Mhm.
so we started using it in Liberty Ale.
Right. And the second point is that this beer got dry hop too, which is probably lost
Oh yes,
tradition
of
for a
course.
while.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we dry hopped it in the cellar, special bags.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right.
that was unique in those days. There was
Yeah.
no dry hopping in England in those days. To be accurate, they did do some dry hopping. Some of the traditional brewers
Mhm.
would put just a little bit of dry hops in the cask before they
All
put
right.
bung in,
The bung.
just,
Mhm. Mhm.
just a touch,
Little.
which was a good idea. But we really took it seriously,
Mhm. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And here you go. You have porter. You have IPA, so-called nowadays dry hop, experimental
Yep.
hops.
Yep.
Some cool stuff. Yeah. And you also produce the Old Foghorn that you mentioned, the barley wine
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
right? So it's
yeah,
just like some of the highlights, but there are more. So the one last thing about Liberty Ale, not really sure that whether can you recall it. How how much relationship with this beer to the Ballantine one?
Ah, well, yeah. You must have read that story or heard the story. I had a hop broker
Hmm.
named Len Richardson. And
Okay.
I told you earlier about how I discovered right away that brewing is a brotherhood.
Hmm.
He was a gentleman, and he took me under his wing and helped me buy hops. In those days, we were just buying local California clusters, but
Right.
he helped me buy them and talk to me about them. And one day he took me to lunch, and he had with him 2 bottles of a beer that Ballantine had made many, many years before. I don't know how many, but I'm guessing it was 10 or 20 years before. And he had loved
Oh
it
my god.
because he was a hop grower. He loved how it was hoppy. It was
Hmm.
brewed under contract by Ballantines in Chicago for a club there called the Fin and Feather Club. Must
Okay.
a hunting and fishing club. That's all I know. And
Hmm.
he poured that ale out, and it just knocked me over. It was dry. It was not dry hopped. He told me it. I knew about dry hopping, the
Right.
tradition way back when in England, but he told me that they had been experimenting with a hop extract at the brewery. They had learned how to extract hops. Nowadays they do it. And one of the ways they do it is with liquid CO2, believe it or not, as a solvent.
Right.
It's very clever because it's organic, it's completely natural.
Hmm.
Anyway, that hoppy ale knocked me for a loop. I
Oh.
loved it. I'd learned, I knew about IPA.
Hmm.
I think it was labeled IPA, but it was a Christmas ale for the Fin and Feather Club. And it was a
Right.
big moment in my life. It had a huge effect on me and my brewery. And then, of course, because of that, later on, all kinds of other breweries. So Len Richards,
Right.
with his Ballantine
20
ale,
years old bottle
should
kind.
get
Yeah.
credit for the whole craft brewery movement. Yeah,
That's
lovely, lovely
amazing.
man, a real gentleman, lovely man.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Right. So, yeah, with all of these beers you produced that was kind of off center for the market wise, how did it receive? Like, how did customer react with them? Do they embrace them? Did they kind of find
Oh, it
them
was terrible. We had a horrible
surprising?
time. I mean, the sales were. I can't even begin to tell you how hard it was to get business in those early days.
Hmm.
Mind you, at first we didn't bottle, and so
Right.
only when we began bottling did we have any chance at all of getting people to try our beers. But
Right.
in those days, the idea of a funny beer with a funny label and a funny flavor, I mean, it was just hardly anybody. The people who bought imported beers
Hmm.
bought would try our beer because they'd look
Right.
at the cabinet and they'd see something unusual and they'd say, well, try a
Let's
bottle.
try one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we were fortunate, I guess, in that San Francisco being one of the most sophisticated markets in the States,
Mhm.
imported beers would come there to give it a try. So
Right.
it was not uncommon to have a new beer available. You'd see something from New Zealand or something
Mm.
from Italy, and it might not last, but they would give it a try. And because it was a cosmopolitan market with
Mhm.
international, open to the international feeling for food and beverage.
Right.
So that was an advantage for us. If we'd been in Omaha, nobody would have tried our beer.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Excellent. Okay, well, I mean, Fritz, I'm very much enjoying this, nostalgic ride, but I'm afraid to say that we are at the tail end of the session.
All right. Well, I've been enjoying it too. It brings back memories.
Yeah. So, I mean, just before we reach the finishing line, I would like to close thing out by asking you this last question, because you've been writing with Anchor for about 45 years, building second breweries, state of the art, and that become kind of a institution for young generations that want to open up a brewery to look up to and consult about. Um, I understand that until your retirement in 2010, you saw all kind of things, the good and the bad, and witnessed a lot of changes in the landscape of beer and brewing scene. My question is, how did you keep yourself and the brewery relevant at that time?
Well, as we began to have competition,
Mhm.
the first serious competitor was Sierra Nevada, and
Okay.
that was almost 15 years after I started.
Yeah.
But they were serious. They came to visit us. Ken Grossman
Mhm.
asked for advice. We used to give advice, and we told him, clean, clean, clean.
Very bold.
He took our advice. He was
Mhm.
they were professional, good brewers right from the beginning, because they took if you're with me, earlier I mentioned the difference between the German way and the English way.
Yeah. Yeah.
They took the German, the modern way,
Approach. Yeah.
cleaning.
German approach. Yeah.
And so we began to have competition, and I was astonished. It never occurred to me that anybody could do what we had done, but they began
Mm.
to do it. And we took them under our wing. We gave them advice. There was a brotherhood, and nobody was infringing on anybody in those days. So the public was growing interest.
Mhm. Mhm.
The brewers were not having any trouble selling. People started buying these beers, and
Right.
so for a long time, the only thing we did to stay alive and to stay happy and to stay excited was to come up with these new products, which we did a lot of. We did wheat beer and barley wine and porter and IPA and Christmas ale. All of those were absolutely unheard of when we launched them. There
Yeah.
was not an all malt ale in England. There
Mhm.
was no porter in England. There were no IPA. I mean, we were way out ahead for a long time, and it was very exciting and it's satisfying. But
Real. Yeah.
but in fact, I would say that one of the reasons I did finally retire was that it was hard to stay out in front. Uh,
Mhm.
we started the whiskey distillery in the front,
Distillation. Yeah. Yeah.
and then gin, partly because we were looking for something to do to be creative again, to be the only one, to be ahead of the
Mm.
crowd. We'd been ahead
Right.
of the crowd for years, for decades, and it was we used to say we've got the world by the tail. The world doesn't know it yet, but we do. We
Yeah.
were, I was sure we were right. Somebody asked me once, "What are you doing, Fritz?" So we were at lunch in a club in San
Mhm.
Francisco, and there was a wine list there on the table.
Right.
And I said, "If I'm right, someday there will be beer lists in restaurants."
Mm.
Well,
And look at
In
it,
Thailand,
right?
we've got beer lists, right?
Yeah, we do.
We were ahead of it for so long. It was so much fun. We were so proud of it. I mean, I can't tell you, it was great fun. It was really fun. Yeah, there was nothing like it in the world. I mean, it was unique. Yeah, and when you walked into the brewery, the new brewery, when we bought that building and then built a new brewery, we'd already built a new brewery in the old brewery,
Right.
but now we built a real brewery with a beautiful building. And when you walked in that brew house, I used to say, I want people to fall down when they walk in that door and see those copper kettles. And there was nothing like it in the world. Many breweries had copper kettles, but the brewmaster's office would be way down at the end of the hall somewhere, and the owner's office would have an abstract painting on the wall. And our brewery, the owner was in the brew house, and all the staff, the offices, and the headquarters were in the brew house. We were all there looking at each other and looking at the brew house. If the kettle started to boil over, because the brewer was maybe downstairs checking, people would run from the office. I would jump up and run from my office. Somebody would run from the lab and run in there and shut the
heater off
to keep it boiling over. The brew house was right in the center of the company. Yeah, it was magic.
Right. Wonderful. That was wonderful. And these are the new brew house, right?
Yeah, there's Betty on the left. I loved Betty. She lived nearby. She got divorced. She had never had to work.
Oh.
She came to work for us, and then later her sons worked for us.
For Anchor.
One of them was basically the brewmaster in later years, but she told me she was so happy with the brewery because she'd never had to work before. The only job she ever had was so nice. You can tell. I mean, she was a wonderful, just a lovely person. Yeah.
Right.
Great company. And there's Sue on the right. She was a Brewster. You know about that word?
No. What is it?
A Baxter is a woman baker, and a Brewster is a female brewer.
Oh, okay. Brewster.
She was the only Brewster in the world, I think, at one time. She worked at our brewery, Sue. She and I had the same birthday.
Oh, share the same birthday. That's cool. And was that your idea of coming up with a white coverall work shirt?
Yeah. I don't know where I got that idea. We used to pay for white T-shirts. We came up with the idea that everybody should not have to spend a lot of money keeping clean. So we would help people pay for a T-shirt, a white T-shirt. Right. And I thought, well, why don't we get coveralls? Let's try it. Mind you, we were in San Francisco, and this was in the 60s or
70s. Yeah.
So we were all bohemian, we were all hippies. I'm sure you've probably seen that picture where we all look
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe the employees would rebel at the idea of a uniform. I'm not going to require it. But let's try it. So we talked about it. We said, well, sure, let's try it. And everybody would save a lot of money on cleaning, laundry, because we'd provide a clean coverall.
Service for them. Yeah.
And then we put the label on the side, and everybody loved it. We all felt like we look professional. We looked good.
Yeah.
We looked like a team. I don't think there was any brewery in the world where they were doing that, but we were doing it, and we felt great about it. We all just loved it. Yeah.
That's excellent.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it was great.
All right. Well,
yeah, so excellent, Chris. I think this is where we will end the session. So thank you so much, for talking us through this wonderful ride. Yeah, and I can tell that I can tell you had a really, really wonderful time with your team at Anchor by telling me this.
They're going to revive it. I met the new owner.
Okay.
He's very excited. He's a good guy.
Yeah, I'm looking forward for the reopening of the brewery too.
Yep.
Okay, I know we are way beyond an hour mark, and it is time to let you go now. I hate to say goodbye, but I have to.
If you get to the city, get to San Francisco, look me up.
Sure, I will. So
Okay.
until then, take good care of your health and
Yeah.
take care, Fritz.
Thanks.
I'll put you down from the screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Bye. Okay. Here you have it, man. I mean, craft beer professional brewing through IFB's pioneer, literally the pioneer of our day and age. I can't think of words to describe, this overjoyed session other than it is an out of the world experience. And I'm really, really happy that this is the very first episode of this season. And I hope that you all will also find, the moment to enjoy it in this wonderful ride as I do. That's all for today. The Good Burp session will be back in no time. So stay tuned. Until next time, cheers and สวัสดีครับ